Welcome back, and today we're going to continue on our tour of the cells, and we're going to talk about the energy organelle. So now that we have a general picture of the cell, so we have a cell membrane that encloses the cell. In eukaryotic cells, we have a nucleus that controls the function and stores the DNA, and we've got the cytoplasm, the gel-like fluid that surrounds the nucleus and holds the organelles. Let's look at the organelles that actually create the energy. So the first one that we're going to look at is the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's double membrane bound, which means that it has an inner and an outer membrane. It's the site of cellular respiration, and because of that, it's found in both plants and animals. Now, it's a common misconception. Some people think that plants just have chloroplasts, which we'll look at next, but they do in fact have mitochondria because they have to be able to use the glucose that they produce to produce energy eventually. So if we look down in the lower left here and look at the structure real quick, here's the parts that you'll be responsible for. So there is an outer membrane, and that is a lipid bilayer, just like we've seen around the nucleus and also the cell membrane. There is an inner membrane that is another lipid bilayer. There is an intermembrane space in between, and when we look at respiration, that'll become more important. And then there's an inner part that's shown in blue here, the matrix. And then the cristae are the infoldings of the inner membrane. So those are the parts of the matrix that you need to be able to identify and remember. And again, those are found in both plants and animals, and they take glucose and turn it into energy that we can use in our own body in the form of ATP, which we'll talk about more as we get along. Now, the second organelle is the chloroplast. So this is found only in plants. This is the site of photosynthesis. So this allows these organisms to capture light energy and convert it into chemical energy, a sugar, most of the case glucose. And the way they do this is they use the pigment called chlorophyll to capture photons of energy from light, and through a series of chemical reactions turn it into sugar. So they take water, H2O, and carbon dioxide, CO2, and turn it into carbohydrate. And we've seen that equation before in the last unit when we talked about the carbohydrates. So again, if we look at the structure, it is a double membrane, so there's an outer membrane. There is an inner membrane, and both of those are phospholipid bilayers. Now, inside the inner membrane, there is a fluid called the stroma. Now, within the stroma, there are these individual little pancake-like structures called thylakoids, and it's on the membrane of the thylakoids that the reactions actually take place. And when we have a stack of thylakoids, we have what's called a granum. So the whole stack of thylakoids is called a granum, and then the space inside the thylakoids is called the lumen. So that's the anatomy of a chloroplast, the structure that you're going to have to be able to recall and work with. And so now let's kind of compare the two. So chloroplasts carry out photosynthesis. Mitochondria carry out cellular respiration, and they are what we call coupled reactions. Okay, that means that they work with each other, and the products of one become the waste products of one become the reactants of the other. So if we look at the diagram here, we have light energy coming in at the top. The chlorophyll in the chloroplast converts that, and it takes carbon dioxide and water and turns it into organic molecules, and we know that as glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen. Well, it just so happens that glucose and oxygen are the reactants for cellular respiration in mitochondria. So they take the sugar and the oxygen and they turn it into ATP, which allows us to do cellular work, and some of it's lost as heat energy. Now, the waste products of respiration are carbon dioxide and water. So when we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon dioxide and water vapor, and it just so happens those are the reactants that are needed for photosynthesis. And so this cycle continues with energy constantly being supplied by photons from the sunlight, And that eventually is converted to ATP that allows our bodies to function, and much of the energy is lost as heat. Now, if we look at them side by side, the chloroplast and the mitochondria, we notice that they've got a very similar structure. They both have a double membrane. They both have their own DNA, and we'll talk specifically about mitochondrial DNA and genetics, and how that is becoming an important tool to track relatedness and the ancestry of humans in particular. They both produce energy, and they could potentially survive on their own. They could be a self-sufficient cell in one way. And that's what we're going to look at in the last slide for this section, is something called the endosymbiosis theory. And this is the idea that bacteria, in the case of maybe a mitochondria and a chloroplast, could have been engulfed by a larger cell, and rather than being digested, they formed a symbiotic relationship where the mitochondria provides energy, the larger cell provides protection, and we have what we now call the eukaryotic cell. So if we follow it from the left on the timeline here, we have what they're calling an ancestral prokaryote. So if you remember, it doesn't have its own nucleus. And over time, by enfolding the plasma membrane, maybe that's how the endoplasmic reticulum, which we haven't talked about yet, and the nucleus formed. So now we have a very simple eukaryotic cell. So there is a nucleus. And at one point, it may have engulfed an aerobic prokaryotic, what looks like a mitochondria, and that could have given rise to the ancestral heterotrophic, something that can't produce its own energy, eukaryote. And if we follow that line of reasoning a little bit further, it then could have possibly engulfed a cell that was a chloroplast, and chloroplast or plastids became incorporated into the cells and gave us our photosynthetic eukaryotes. So the endosymbiosis theory is a way of looking at how potentially mitochondria and chloroplasts could have been self-sufficient cells on their own at one point, and over time they became engulfed and formed a symbiotic relationship with these larger cells. So until next time, we'll talk to you then.